Just as a matter of observation, I've seen 7 distinct types of weapons throwers. These are both body types and psychological types. We want to talk a little bit about the challenges of each.
The first thing we have to do before we develop further is recognize our own type. That isn't always easy to do, but we can give you a tip or two to help. The first kind of thrower is the power overhand thrower, what we sometimes call a pitcher. A power overhand thrower usually has long limbs and is always good from long range early in the process. They have a baseball pitcher coming off the mound type delivery. Their arm action is like a windmill, a big arc turning with the shoulder as a pivot. They're the slowest and most deliberate type of thrower, but they come heavy when they arrive. A shot put type thrower uses a release action different from most throwers. They sometimes try to lob the weapon in more than throw it, and as a result they typically don't have enough momentum on their throws as beginners. They tend to mistime the release by releasing either too much before they flip the wrist or releasing completely after they flip the wrist. They're typically hesitant and tentative. The sidearm thrower has a long, lazy throwing motion that sweeps in from the side. It's really the same throw as that windmill arm action of the power overhand thrower, only the wheel is turned at a 90-degree angle. Typically they turn their wrist at a different angle than other throwers, feeling more comfortable turning the wrist plane vertical instead of horizontal, and they usually use a little more of a locked elbow than other throwers. What we call a compact thrower uses a quick elbow chop to generate momentum on the throw, similar to the motion we use to drop a weapon in at close range, only with more power. This type has the quickest release and are naturally accurate, but hit the wall sooner than other types, meaning they're good back to a certain range but can't throw beyond that range. They tend to be compact in body type and very consistent in their mechanics. Punch throwers, as I call them, are often martial artists, and they throw like they're throwing a punch. They try to shoot the weapon out quickly and force it in. When they're hitting, it works perfectly, and when they start missing, they miss over and over. This type is very instinctive and has a style natural for hand-to-hand combat, but they usually don't consciously understand what they're doing. Hand-to-eye coordination throwers use manual dexterity to control the weapon. Sometimes in some idiosyncratic fashion others don't always understand. They often like to tinker with either their pet throw or a variety of throws instead of mastering the more useful throws. A natural underhand thrower does just that, hits on the underhand throw and decides it makes more sense for him than overhand throwing.
The thing about being a type is you can't fight your type. You have to accept it, go with it, and make the best of it.
It's my belief that our greatest strengths are only the flip side of our greatest weaknesses. I've often said that in throwing, everything's a trade-off. If you do something well, you have to trade something else. Each type has a particular strength inherent to it and a particular weakness. So once you've recognized your type, in order to go forward, you need to learn the fixes for the weaknesses of your type.
Up first is what we call the pitcher or the power overhand thrower.
The advantage of being an overhand power thrower is that you naturally have good range and the most power of any style. The disadvantage is that while this is a great knife throwing style, you're too slow for real-world martial arts throwing. Also, this is the worst defensive throw because it leaves you leaning into the target in the follow-through instead of in good balance and good defensive position. You need to learn to shorten your delivery and use your elbow more to generate power from close range. So for a quick fix, try using a little more of a chopping action instead of just leaning into the target and trying to generate more and more force on throws.
The next type tends to have less early success than the pitcher type, but that doesn't mean they can't have more success later on. We call these shot putters.
The advantage of this type is that your style naturally lends itself to smaller improvised weapons, and once you learn, you have a good release for street throwing. You usually have more of a frozen release or a sudden throw your hand open release, and that kind of throw is versatile in terms of the equipment you can use. The disadvantage of this type is that you're limited in terms of range and power. Also, you need to learn a better fighting stance. This type tends to face the target like they want to shake hands with it. Be conscious of your footwork and the angle of your shoulders when you throw. Another thing for this type is that you need to concentrate on release timing, which has to be a little more precise with the types of release they prefer. One thing you can do with that more frozen release is push on the balance point, as we saw earlier. If you're really having trouble with even getting weapons to stick, you might try experimenting with different grips and also choke up and down to master the shuriken style push on the balance point type of release. Sometimes this type of thrower keeps his or her hands too far forward, doesn't give the weapon a chance to generate any momentum. Remember that you have to swing something back before you can swing it forward. You have to generate at least a little momentum with your arm. You can't just let go of a weapon and hope it's going to do all the work for you. You need to add some chop action or some swing action somewhere before you release the throw.
Next step is the sidearm thrower, or the sidewinder as they're sometimes called. I call them cowboys because they look like they're about to lasso a calf before they throw.
The advantage of the sidearm throw is that it's a natural combat angle for knife throwing style. The disadvantage is that most natural sidearm throwers have too long of a throwing motion. These are the second slowest types of throwers, and in some cases even slower than power overhand throwers. There are some sidearm throwers who have a hitch in their release, or wave the weapon back to get momentum before they release, or have to do some complicated wind-up before they throw. All that is counterproductive and unnecessary. The best motion is the one with no wasted motion. The most important thing for you as a sidearm thrower is to shorten the release, make it quicker. One way to do this is to learn to loosen up that elbow and use more elbow chop for close range throwing. You need to learn to chop down with the elbow for street throwing. Another is to learn to use a little bit more of a windmill action, coming from a higher arm angle. A technical note about targets that applies specifically to sidearmers. You might be a little frustrated with knives not sticking into vertical wood grain targets. That's because with this type of throwing, knives tend to hit against the grain more often. You won't have that problem with spikes, so just using spikes is a quick fix for training for sidearmers.
The type of thrower has a short, compact throwing motion I sometimes call a butcher because they look like they're chopping meat when they throw.
The advantage is that this type of throw is quick and accurate and well suited for street throwing, particularly if you use the thumb grip. The disadvantage is that it's a little weak and limited in range. This type of thrower also tends to face the target a little too much. As a compact thrower, you generate power mostly with your wrist and elbow. To get better from longer range, elongate your motion a little and lock your elbow and wrist a little more. Don't just chop with your elbow like you're chopping wood or chopping meat on a block. Learn to throw from more arm angles. This type also tends to have a little too much of an open stance. Don't point your feet towards the target, point them at a right angle to the target. Lift your lead foot, then rock forwards. This will get you some of the momentum you need to improve your range and put you in better defensive position in the follow-through after the throw.
Experienced martial artists often throw weapons like they're throwing punches, which is not necessarily a bad thing. Some others have this style as well.
The advantage of this type is that they naturally assume a fighting stance, which is very similar to a normal throwing stance and is obviously ideal for self-defense. They also have a quick release. The biggest problem with this type is that they're pure streak throwers because they don't really consciously know what they're doing. This type, more than any other, has it then loses it. You act too fast, trying to run before you can walk, and you don't understand your own mechanics. Punch throwers tend to get in a bad rut because when they miss, they try to force the issue and overuse wrist and elbow action and mistime their release. What you will need to do to fix this is to learn the details of the correct release for a weapon and to be able to visualize what you're doing so you can recreate your successful throws at will. To do this, slow everything down. Don't throw and hope and wait for it to click. Go back to the floor block, center yourself, and understand what you're doing and why it fails when it fails. Then you'll be able to resume throwing full speed with confidence.
Some throwers rely on hand-eye coordination to achieve all their results. My cute little nickname for them is handyman. I call them that for two reasons. One, they can use their hands to fix anything like a handyman, and also because they like to tinker around like handymen.
Hand-eye coordination throwers are the gifted students of weapons throwing. They sometimes can go to advanced stages in day 1 or 2 of training. The disadvantage is that, like gifted students, they sometimes think they already know everything and are only interested in their own preferences. This type sometimes gets attracted to minor throws and tinkers with them to the exclusion of all else. To my way of thinking, this is a waste of their great talent. The last thing a street thrower wants to be is over-specialized. Another weakness hand throwers have is that they are so able to compensate using their hands in weapon control that they get sloppy with their footwork, and they are often guilty of taking bad attack angles and using slow releases. Also, we do not want to rely on hand-eye coordination because it goes away in a fight. What I recommend to fix the over-reliance on hand-eye coordination is to reduce your hand control by wearing thick gloves or mittens on your hands when you throw. because as street throwers, we want to be able to use gross motor skills to throw even when our hands are not working.
Underhand throwers are kind of the anomaly of throwers.
The great advantage of the underhand is that it's probably the best defensive throw in that it leaves you in very good defensive position after release. Also, it's a very quick releasing throw and comes from a deadly attack angle. This is also possibly the easiest throw to learn right away. For most people, it's best to learn this throw with a thumb on top grip and using a larger, heavier weapon. Rock back a little and step forward for extra momentum, just like you do when throwing overhand. This is still the same principle of the half circle flight pattern, but the clock is upside down now. So we begin at 9 o'clock, release at 6 o'clock, and the weapon rises to stick at 3 o'clock. If you let go too late, it will stick at 12 o'clock, meaning it will stick into your ceiling. Chop your arm upwards at as close to a straight vertical line or up and down angle as possible. Keep your wrist and elbow locked and throw your hand open suddenly on release. Your hand should end up at about your ear in the follow-through. The only disadvantage to the underhand throw is limited range, but this is a good combat range throw if you're using a bigger weapon. Some people attach a sort of stigma to underhand throwing, probably because they're used to ball sports or something, and overlook anything that isn't power overhand throwing. For a serious thrower, this is a ridiculous attitude. Everyone should learn the underhand throw, but the reality is too few do. If you're one of those few who finds that this is your calling, go with it. The fact is that the mechanics of this throw are really not dissimilar to a more conventional overhand street throw, in that you can also use a more locked wrist and even locked elbow and chop down instead of chopping up. In other words, with practice you can perform this throw sort of in reverse, the windmill coming down instead of coming up, and with this same sudden throw your hand open kind of release. It's clumsy, slow, and short range, but you can get sticks with it. This is actually a version of something that is called the palm throw from the old knife throwing underground, sort of a primitive forerunner of the modern no-spin throw.
These types all overlap to some degree, and what we want to do to become complete throwers is to master all the different types of throwing. You can't fight your type, but you can go beyond it. As you advance further and further in the discipline, you're less and less subject to the limitations of your own type.